Xavier Castellanos, an old friend of the ISRM, Under-Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, somebody who's deeply involved in this. The Red Cross, I think the numbers are 160 million people a year that you deal with on a daily basis in their lives. You, Xavier, are actually the inspiration for this webinar, because about 3 years ago, we were talking about your Strategy 2030, the IFRC Strategy 2030. And classically, the International Federation of the Red Cross, which has traditionally, I think, dealt with the rural poor and the rural crisis, was understanding that center of energy was moving into the cities, and there was an urban reality. And we were discussing that then. And very much what we put out a discussion paper together between the ISRM and IFRC. And that was actually the starting point for what we've done here. So thank you for that, first of all. Xavier, I am sure that you and your people have unbelievable amounts of pressure on you from all over the world right now. So first of all, you have our sympathy and our thanks for the work the IFRC is doing. Anybody who does this work anywhere around the world knows the IFRC is an incredibly powerful and influential and good organization. So please, I think we should all pass that message on to your people who sometimes may feel they're unloved and unnoticed. They're not. They are deeply loved and deeply noticed. But I'd love to hear your thoughts now on both on the world in general, but also the IFRC as an influential organization, how sort of global urban resilience is affecting you and your people. So Xavier, great to have you here. The floor is yours.
No, thank you very much, and apologize as well for the technical glitches, but I heard everyone, which is good news. And I have to say, always is inspiring to have these opportunities for all of us to be together. I think it's critical to look the key point around what exposure to hazard means when we have a difference in terms of location, in terms of how socioeconomic status do have to say at the end of the day when we are talking about vulnerabilities. And I think that's something that we are all the time dealing with. Exposure, those hazards, what the vulnerabilities, but very little, and this connects very much with what Sheela has mentioned. We talk very little about the capacities that exist. And I think we have to always look into the hazard, not only based on vulnerabilities, but look into the capacities, be at the local level, be individual, be institutional, or be community capacities. Is crucially important for any change that we want to make. The high density, when we look, the other element on when we talk about urban, the high density of built up areas, be it concrete, asphalt, glass, and the lack of green areas and open public spaces and air pollution create conditions where heat accumulates. And this links very much to what, again, was mentioned about we have to look at the urban development and the urban risk associated also with the climate and how this creates some level of heat islands effects in urban communities. Many urban areas are in geographical locations, as I mentioned before, exposed to the effects of climate change. And this links to coastal zones, river banks, or deltas. And there it comes the concentration of how these communities living in these areas could be affected by different shocks. But also we know that there are areas with geological and geotechnical conditions where we see unstable soils or we see fall of lines or tectonic plates that constitute a high risk, especially in informal settlements, are often built on hazardous sites. And that's something that is happening over and over and over again and has to do a lot of, again, with how legislation is also taking into consideration this risk and accumulating the risk. It has also been mentioned the issue about the interdependency. And I think it's crucial, this component interdependency of urban systems, such as water supply, electricity, public transport, but also the role of the police, the role of the social services in urban areas, and how are these can increase the risk of cascading effects. When one system is affected, it can trigger a chain of reaction of additional events or impacts, in many occasions leading to increasingly severe consequences. These effects amplifies the risk that even minor shocks or stresses can escalate into a major crisis. But when events, if we can take the example of Turkey, when events like this happens, it is becoming crucially important. This not only interdependency, understanding, but this capacity to have a multi-sectoral approach in terms of how to respond to those crises. In the case of Turkey, I think something that we have to learn on what happened with Turkey is if we compare the Turkey operation in the earthquake in the year 2001, I guess it was 2001 or 2003, and the response here, where the interconnectedness, the multi-sectorial approach, the preparedness of the population in Turkey and of organizations was of a crucial importance. Let me give you the example of the Turkish Red Crescent Society. The Turkish Red Crescent Society was in charge of the distribution of 4 to 5 million of the distribution of food every single day, morning, early morning, afternoon, at night. To do that, it requires a multi-sectorial group of people supporting in order to guarantee that food is being distributed through the coordination mechanism where the Turkish Red Crescent Society was playing the role. Second, that has the right conditions of quality, and therefore it has to be some level of supervision where it was given by the Turkish Red Crescent Society, and the capacity to ensure that it can be distributed. 4 to 5 million foods every day was distributed. Just imagine what does it mean in terms of the preparedness in the capacity of responding. But also in this interconnectedness, the technology. How technology play a tremendous role in terms of ensuring that communities will have access to relevant information, individuals will have access to relevant information of where to go, what kind of support they can receive, where and in what conditions. But this also link to one of the priorities that also Sheela mentioned about identifying what local communities want. And this community engagement and accountability, listening to communities, was put in place in the first hours of the operation. So here what I'm trying to say, this interdependency also needs to come with interconnectedness and good preparedness in order to respond to crisis. The other point that I want to highlight is the high density of people living in limited spaces and in poor and unsanitary living conditions. So here we see that it increases the risk of epidemics, another risk for physical and mental health. And if there is not action, disease, chronic stress, domestic violence, fire outbreaks form part of this increase of risks in such conditions. Urban dwellers are also more exposed to systemic risks. And what will be those systemic risks are clearly linked to weak governance and law enforcement systems, weak social support systems, lack of cultural cohesion, or unequal access to livelihood opportunities. And let me just put a moment there on livelihood opportunities because it's a critical condition for community mobilization and for giving the community the opportunity and the conditions in order to move from livelihood recovery to more a notion of livelihood protection for any type of risk. But at the same time, we have to look these systemic risks from the social point of view and economical point of view. Poverty, exclusion, social tensions. This is a recipe to increase violence and crime. So we have to look into those elements as well. And the concentration of governments or economic activities and populations in urban areas, is capturing the mobilization of people from the rural area to the urban communities. And increase puts cities at the higher risk of being targeted with also hostilities, violence attacks, or parties conflicting in different circumstances. But let me finalize now on key points around vulnerabilities. Because in urban population rely on infrastructure provision of services, markets, and other systems that they have little or no control over. And this is an important differentiation when we talk about rural communities. Rural communities, they will have more conditions because they have the land, they have their production, etc., etc. In urban communities, this is completely different. And this dependency on systems to provide for basic needs makes urban population vulnerable. To what extent it depends on the specific area or neighborhoods of socio-economic status or capacity. And the lack of access or exclusion from public services, water supply, sewages, electricity, and solid waste management causes unsanitary and undignified conditions that negatively impact physical and mental health and create a serious condition of high vulnerability. And we have to look in that area as well. And if you look, I will put just a moment of reflection on waste management when we had the pandemic. Imagine that in those urban areas, we wouldn't have the institutions with the capacity to manage the waste. So we have those silent or those invisible individuals who were able to guarantee that not further epidemics will happen in the middle of the pandemic in many urban contexts. And again, how systems, how services function and operate are so crucial to reduce vulnerabilities. The other element, the informal settlements or be as renters increase the vulnerability to eviction, informal employment compromises people's economic stability and makes them vulnerable to exploitation and external shocks and stress. And that is the other element that we need to be looking. So I just try to highlight these elements in order for us to look into the associated vulnerabilities. And if you allow me, many of those risks and vulnerabilities are known by their own communities and are known the risks by their own communities and are known by their own communities how to cope with those risks. And what is needed for the risk management is to action from a bottom up. In order to communities be the ones first to mobilize and to understand their risk deep and the solutions as well, and to connect with local authorities in terms of how local authorities can support communities to reduce the risk identified that can be in the capacity of local communities to deal with those risks. And then I end with one comment on Ukraine, because I think it's super important what Jaroslav mentioned. And a few weeks back, I had the opportunity to meet with the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine. And our dialogue centered in the reconstruction and in the resilience building of Ukraine. On the need not only to concentrate on the current conflict, but on the need to invest on community and economic empowerment in order to build livelihoods, in order to live the conditions of resilience in the middle of the crisis. And I think that is a bold perspective in terms of saying, in any crisis, we have to build resilience from the very beginning of the crisis, not at the very end of the crisis. So I will stop there, David.